Meneer de ambassadeur, meneer de rector, geachte vice-rectoren, dear colleagues, students and alumni, it is my great pleasure to welcome you at yet another online ambassador's lecture. This time with a Belgian ambassador. Luc Jacobs is an alumnus of our alma mater, holding a master degree of our law faculty and also a postgraduate master degree in social law of the VUB. Ambassador Jacobs is leading our diplomatic post in Warsaw, Poland, representing Belgium in Poland and Lithuania since September 2018. Prior to his current assignment, he was ambassador of Belgium in Ukraine. Luc Jacobs entered the Foreign Services now 35 years ago already. He served as deputy head of mission in Dublin, Ottawa and Prague, and was later on head of unit for bilateral relations with the then EU candidate countries in Brussels. At the turn of the century, this was. During the Belgian presidency of the EU in the second half of 2001, he was also in charge of the negotiations leading up to the EU-Ukraine summit in Yalta and the EU-Russia summit in Brussels. From 2002 till 2007, he held various positions at the permanent representation of Belgium to the EU and worked for 1 year as advisor to the Belgian Secretary of State for European Affairs. He also served as Consul General in Casablanca, and on his second home posting, he was Director for Economic and Monetary Union, European Budget and European Social, Environmental and Cohesion Policy. From this resume, it is very obvious that it would be difficult to find a more suitable diplomat to talk about the political background related to the activities of our recently established Regional Committee on Central and Eastern Europe. Some of the activities of this Regional Committee, which is chaired by Professor Jos van der Sloten, will be discussed at a forthcoming event in June that largely will focus on scientific collaboration between KU Leuven and our partner institutions in the region. Please look forward to the invitation of that event. As KU Leuven, we have close ties with Central and Eastern Europe, and in particular with Poland. They are intense and long-standing. Within the Central Europe Leuven Strategic Alliance, CELSA in short, we cooperate with 9 universities in the region to support joint research programs from KU Leuven involving significant investments of the Special Research Fund. By the way, if you would be interested to seek financing from this strategic alliance, there is a call currently opened until, if I'm not wrong, the 7th of May, so please consider to collaborate with your colleagues. Another example is the close collaboration of the League of European Research Universities, LERU, with the so-called CE7 Alliance, a group of 7 research-intensive universities in Central Europe. And last, but certainly not least, the Jagiellonian University of Krakow is one of our very close partners in Una Europa, our European University Alliance network. This makes our connection with the Polish academic world stronger than ever before. Let me give you a couple of numbers. We currently have not less than 94 educational agreements on mobility and study programs with in total 41 Polish universities and institutions of higher education. Every year, more than 200 Polish students study at KU Leuven, and we team up for research projects with 14 Polish universities with, for instance, 22 Horizon 2020 projects. But our connection goes much beyond projects, contracts and agreement. I'm sure that many of you will join me in the appreciation of very intense cooperation and warm friendships with our colleagues and fellow students. Visiting a Polish partner institution and hosting Polish friends always is a joy. That being said, one may get the impression of seemingly a lot of political noise in the line between Poland, as well as some other Central European countries, with countries in the West the last couple of years. This actually relates very closely to the topic of the lecture of today. Our honorary guest will speak about the European Union and Poland, a tale of misunderstanding, ? This lecture is the main course of the evening, and we will soon move to that. The talk of the ambassador will be followed by a comment delivered by Professor Natasha Stishinska from the Institute of European Studies of Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Natasha, if I may say, we know each other quite well, is not only an expert on the topic of today, she also is one of the leading forces in the joint bachelor program on European studies that KU Leuven is currently implementing in collaboration with our 7 partners of Una Europa. After her intervention, there will be time for questions based on the questions that will be collected via our online platform in a debate moderated by Professor Verpoest. Please prepare your questions and submit them during the talk, but please do not be disappointed if your question will not be chosen. We typically have many more that can be dealt with in the Q&A session. But first, before starting with the main course of this evening, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Verpoest, professor at our Faculty of Arts from the research group Modernity and Society, to introduce the topic of today. Professor Verpoest, over to you.
Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Vice Rector, dear colleagues, professors, dear students. I'm happy to give an introduction to the lecture of Ambassador Jacobs, which I will of course keep short because I'm looking forward to his lecture. So I will limit myself to trying to provide you with some historical background on the trajectory of Poland since 1989. Now, as a professor of history of Central and Eastern Europe, I can say that Poland has had a fascinating, at times tragic history, but also always has shown remarkable resilience, and as visitors to the country still can witness now, along the way has developed a beautiful culture and architecture. As a professor of diplomatic history, I can say that before 1989, Poland was considered a forerunner in bringing about societal change. And this happened not only, this happened not only through the strikes in the 1970s and Lech Wałęsa's activities in the early 1980s in the Solidarność movement, but Poland was also a forerunner in the transition to democratization and free markets in the 90s. In Poland, this actually started in 1989. It was a time of extreme political turmoil. Many communist states were on the brink of collapse, and the risk of violence was still high. But in Poland, in early 1989, the Polish opposition and the communist leaders gathered around a huge table that you can see here and started the legendary Round Table negotiations. And these negotiations led to an agreement. The communists allowed major institutional reforms, a new parliament, the position of president was created, and also they allowed partially free elections. And these elections turned out to be a landslide victory for Solidarność. They won every possible seat but one. So while the rest of Europe was in chaos, it seemed that Poland managed to negotiate what Michael McFaul, important researcher on this topic, called a pacted transition. What does this mean? Civil society and the communist elite met each other in the middle. So civil society organizations like Solidarność entered politics, whereas the communists avoided prosecution by including them into the political arena. And they succeeded in what Samuel Huntington called elite bargains. Now, because of this pacted transition, Poland has, let's say, ever since been seen by the West as a leading example of successfully transforming a country in the early 90s. And the expectations from the West were very high. European integration was the way forward, and Poland led the way. But how did the Poles look at their past? In his first speech for the Sejm, which is the Polish parliament, on 24 August 1989, the then Prime Minister, some of you might remember him, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, made a symbolic statement. He said it was necessary for the Poles to draw what one calls a gruba linia, a thick line under the past, and to look forward. Starting out with a clean slate was, in his eyes, the best thing to do, especially because in the early 90s the country faced serious economic challenges in the transition that was ahead. So he said, from now on, we will only be responsible for what we have done to get Poland out of its current state of depression. Now, if we look at how Poland moved forward in the past 3 decades, it seems exactly what Poland has done. After an intensive process of adapting to Western standards in the 90s, Poland became a member of NATO in 1999 and an EU member state in 2004. In the West, Euro optimism was high about the huge enlargement of 2004. Yet we may have been a bit blind for the Euroscepticism in Poland already then. In the 2004 and especially the 2009 parliamentary elections, the European parliamentary elections, most Polish parties like Self-Defense, the League for Polish Families, and the by now famous Law and Justice Party won their seats in the European Parliament with a Eurosceptic program. And also, not all Poles were convinced that a thick line should be drawn under Poland's communist past. The whole democratic transition process now seems to be discredited in Poland. The round table agreement and the negotiations that I just showed are now perceived or depicted as a conspiracy of the communists to cling to power. Euro optimism seems to have been replaced by governmental Euroscepticism. Incidents are abundant. And what should we make of this? Today, diplomacy has many challenges. There is a speed of communication, the often very sharp and direct digital diplomacy, disinformation, and the ever-widening international cleavages. All these challenges require an extra set of skills on top of everything an ambassador already has to do. For Ambassador Jacobs, being a diplomat in Poland, which is part of the same regional organization as Belgium, the European Union, seems at first sight a unifying factor. Yet when we see contestation of EU law and fundamental rights in Poland, this becomes a challenge. In these European-level discussions, the contestation of the European Union often goes hand in hand with the claim of sovereignty. Kinga Baranowska, a researcher at Malmö University, last year studied the use of sovereignty arguments in the speeches of current Polish President Andrzej Duda. And her conclusion was that Duda describes the European Union as a threat to Polish national identity and uses arguments about Polish sovereignty as a political tool to justify Polish policies that sometimes counter EU policies. Now, already many decades ago, almost a century ago, the British diplomat Harold Nicholson, who was an active diplomat and later wrote a lot about diplomacy, he wrote, I think in the 1930s, about the challenges that diplomacy faced back then. And he wrote, I quote, "You will all agree that good diplomacy, whether as policy or as negotiation, necessitates something consistent, certain, and precise. Yet faced with sovereignty arguments in foreign affairs, policy becomes inevitably inconsistent, uncertain, and vague." And this is a challenge we still face now. Do we speak the same language? Do we share the same goals? And can we find a common discourse? We look forward to the context and insights Ambassador Jacobs will give us tonight about how to understand what is currently going on in Poland. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice Rector, Professor Verpost, dear audience, few people in the room, but many people remotely. Needless to say that I feel very honored to have been invited to the Ambassador's lecture series of the university. I'm indeed a proud alumnus of, and I'm also very happy to hear about the very intense cooperation, academic cooperation and student exchange that my university, if I may say so, is organizing with Poland and with Polish universities. When I was asked to speak today about issues concerning the rule of law and human rights in Poland, I have readily accepted the challenge, but maybe slightly underestimating what a challenge it actually is. It is indeed a multiple challenge for me. It's an intellectual challenge because these issues are multifaceted, rooted in a specific institutional and societal context. They are subject to extensive political and judicial scrutiny and often subject of a heated, not to say polarized debate. And it is also a professional challenge because I'm conscious, of course, of my official capacity. So I will approach the subject respectfully and in a nuanced way and inevitably with the necessary reserve. And if this is a lecture, I will not start to lecture somebody or it is indeed not my intention to point fingers, to accuse or whatever. And the question mark in the title of my exposé is there on purpose. It is said, but European affairs mostly get media attention when it is about controversy, contention, crisis. And ahead of this evening, I did again the test. I Googled alongside each other European Union and Poland, and then what do you find even, let's say, lines speaking about Polexit, or there is the, we are reminded of the veto against the MFF recovery fund in the run-up to the European Council. There is concern about media freedom. There is the recent resolution of the European Parliament declaring the EU to be an LGBT freedom zone. There is the Polish and Hungarian challenge of the rule of law mechanism before the Court of Justice, and I could go on like that. Again, it is said that it is only those aspects that are getting the news, and also when I will dwell upon some of these controversial issues, it does not mean that I would want to reduce Poland's membership of the European Union to these issues alone. Indeed, as Professor Verpost has already pointed out, Poland has a very impressive legacy with regard to its EU membership so far. On the 1st of May, we will celebrate the 17th anniversary of Poland's accession to the European Union. And let us not forget that Poland was the first country, first of the new member states that led a successful presidency of the European Union already after 11 years, already in 2011. And from a broader historical perspective, also as Professor Verpost has pointed out, let us be reminded of the fact that the obstinate resistance and civil disobedience, most visibly incarnated by the Solidarność movement, contributed substantially to the fall of the Iron Curtain and to Europe's historic reunification. But my exposé is about misunderstandings in its various meanings. And to keep structuring my reasoning, I chose a quote from a top song of the 60s you all know, "Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood," written for singer-pianist Nina Simone and made into a hit by the Animals. I will not sing it for you, but I just quote, "When everything goes wrong, I seem to be bad, but I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood." And that will be the line I will be following. When everything goes wrong, I seem to be bad. So what went wrong? I will only expand on two issues that have been very much and still are in the media and are illustrative of the points I would like to make regarding the deeper challenges for the European Union. And this is the reform of the judiciary since 2015 and the so-called LGBT-free zones. Let's start with the LGBT-free zones. The controversy started in February 2019 when the mayor of Warsaw signed an LGBT declaration against homophobia. He wanted to show that the Polish capital city was a friendly and inclusive place, and he saw the need for political leaders, also at the local government level, to take a determined stand against homophobia and discrimination and to bring about a positive change in social behavior. And then a month later already, a council of a district in the southwest of Poland adopted a adopted a declaration calling their county free from LGBT ideology. And a few days later, the very militant non-governmental organization, the Ordo Iuris Institute for Legal Culture, announced its local government charter of the rights of the family. This so-called family charter does not mention LGBT, but reaffirms a certain reading of the values as enshrined in the Polish constitution, among which the identity of marriage as a relationship between a woman and a man, family and parenthood. But since then, 55 local regional authorities signed such anti-LGBT ideology declarations or resolutions, and 39 adopted these family charters. This trend prompted activists to launch the Atlas of Hate, mapping municipalities, counties, and voivodeships that have adopted or rejected the resolution or a family charter, as well those that are heavily lobbied to do so. I also mentioned counties, municipalities, local governments that have rejected these resolutions. Indeed, also such political stance is taken in Poland, of course, and it is also interesting to note that already one city withdraw its anti-LGBT ideology declaration. In June last year, in full campaign for his re-election, the incumbent Polish president presented his concept of a family charter aimed at the protection of the traditional family model. It also promises, among others, to protect children against LGBT ideology and to ban the propagation of LGBT ideology in schools and public institutions. And then on the 9th of November last year, the Life and Family Foundation submitted to the Polish Parliament a citizens' bill called Stop LGBT. If passed, the bill will ban public manifestations for LGBT rights and equality. These are the facts. On the reform of the judiciary, the reform of the judiciary started in late 2015 when the new elected Polish government indeed embarked upon this comprehensive reform of the justice system. I will not go into all the detail of these reforms, but they are really wide-ranging. For example, A new law reintroduced the merger of the position of the Minister of Justice and Prosecutor General, and conferred further considerable powers to the new Prosecutor General / Minister of Justice. This new law was challenged before the Constitutional Court of Poland, but by that time the Constitutional Court also was already in a very deep political and, we may say, legal crisis because of the fact that it allegedly contained illegally appointed judges. Indeed, the newly elected government wanted to repair what they saw as an unacceptable situation, and these were last-minute appointments by the outgoing government into the Constitutional Court. And the result of this controversy is that the Constitutional Tribunal in its current composition is contested, because allegedly in contradiction with Polish law and even with the Polish constitution itself. Further reforms touched upon the National Council of the Judiciary, which is the body that deals with the nomination and admission to the profession of judges, their promotion, their transfer, their dismissal. Amendments also regarding law amendments sharpening disciplinary proceedings against judges, also touching upon the content of their judgments, and also important and far-reaching reform of the Supreme Court of Poland, where two new chambers were created, the disciplinary chamber and the so-called chamber of extraordinary control and public affairs, that creates a sort of an extraordinary appeal, even with retroactive effect. And then a last important addition to the reform process is the so-called muzzle law, called like that because it limits the possibility for judges to ask questions, to ask preliminary questions even to the European Court of Justice when it concerned the statute and legality of a position of a certain judge appointed by the newly composed and contested National Council of the Judiciary. Muzzle law also because of the fact that further disciplinary measures have been introduced, and a very controversial law to which I will come back in a minute. These are the facts. This is what we see happen. The events have caused a lot of concern at home in Poland, but also in the European Union and wider in the international community. And the defensive line Polish authorities are developing in this is that they ask us urgently to distinguish facts from fake, and also Polish authorities explain the underlying well-intentioned motivation of the judicial reforms, and I will set those out in a few lines. When it comes to the LGBT-free zones, the official story is that local governments want to shield their communities from a hostile LGBT ideology. Local and regional councils that adopted these declarations stress that these declarations are only symbolic, that they have no legally binding force and are not addressed against individual LGBT people. Instead, they are intended to protect against what is called an excessive LGBT movement, or against the promotion in the public sphere of what is called LGBT ideology. Regarding the family charter, it is explained that these charters do not even mention LGBT people, and as such do not impact them. They only explain or family charters are not more than a reaffirmation of relevant articles of the Polish constitution, simply promoting family rights without discriminating against LGBT people. So it is claimed LGBT-free zones do not exist. And indeed, there is some confusion about these LGBT-free zones. And this confusion has arisen because an LGBT activist had started in January 2020 to put up fake yellow road signs at the entrance of those municipalities that had adopted such declarations or charter. Signatories of these documents now feel the allegations as part of a deliberate campaign to slander and intimidate, and a number of local authorities have indeed launched libel cases against these LGBT activists. But it should be noted that the term LGBT-free zone is not the invention of these activists. It is to be attributed to a Polish weekly, Gazeta Polska, that in July 2019 announced to distribute in one of its issues stickers with the text Strefa wolna od LGBT free zones and a black X across an image of a rainbow flag. After legal action was brought against the weekly, the court ordered the stickers to be withdrawn from distribution. Local governments are supported in their defense by the central authorities, as for example the government plenipotentiary for equality, who underlines that Poland is a country where LGBT people can live freely and with dignity with an impartial justice system. On the reform of the judiciary, the reforms, it is said that these reforms were long overdue. The reforms launched by the newly elected government in Poland are officially explained as a long overdue response to the low level of public trust in the judiciary and in its independent functioning, as well as a systemic problem of excessive length of legal proceedings. The stated goal of the reforms was to make the courts more efficient and to enhance the democratic accountability of the Polish judiciary. One of the stated arguments of the authorities for lowering the retirement age has been the need to decommunize the Supreme Court, as no proper lustration of the judiciary was carried out in Poland till then. Often, Polish authorities also use the argument that certain aspects of the reform do also exist in other countries, which means that they would therefore automatically be in accordance with European standards. Or otherwise, if criticism is expressed, it means that double standards are being used. What is permitted in one country would not be allowed in another. This argument has extensively been used in a white paper on the reform of the Polish judiciary published by the Polish authorities. This argument is duly noted in the various reports, analyses, and recommendations that have been made on the judicial reforms in Poland by various international organizations. I will come back to those. The reforms these reports point out have to be understood in the context of the total corpus of legislation and the institutional setup of the country concerned. What is of concern in Poland is the negative cumulative effect of various reforms for the institutional checks and balances and the separation of powers. The tendency to justify controversial reforms referring to similar practices in other countries would amount to what has been called the Frankensteinization of legislation, meaning legislation that is created out of a combination of worst practices existing in other countries. This is a quote from the president of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, to which I will come back later. In the song we hear, "O Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood." So the question is whether the controversy caused is due to a regrettable misreading of the facts, and whether the concern raised in Poland and abroad by Poland's European and international peers boils down to an unfortunate misunderstanding. In this complex debate and in an endeavor to better appreciate and value the various claims and counterclaims, allegations and defense lines, I chose to retreat to the more serene and balanced sphere of expert opinions and legal argumentations stemming from those multilateral organizations and institutions that are the guardians of the prevailing international and European legal order and human rights architecture. These organizations thrive on mutual cooperation and trust, on peer review. They give guidance and formulate recommendations, and in their judicial dimension exert peer pressure. There is a mass of information given the number of institutions and instances involved, be it the European institutions themselves, but also the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the United Nations. Their analyses, recommendations, judgments are based on a thorough understanding of the subject matter, comparative studies, as well as well-established and constant jurisprudence, built up in tempore non suspecto, one may say, and most often allowing for ample dialogue, dissenting opinions, and substantiated and valid counter-argument. What do we find when we read at more length these documents? On the anti-LGBT declarations, I would like to mention recent visits, fact-finding missions or consultations that have been held by the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights and a fact-finding mission in November last year by the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe. In their findings, we can read that indeed LGBT issues are heavily politicized in Poland, and this, as explained already, in an election context. It was the presidential election, but also the parliamentary elections already in October 2019. The Council of Europe delegations also found that even if technically these declarations are not directed against individuals nor a group of people, but against a so-called ideology, they exacerbate an already polarized situation, and they form an obstacle in the way of improving existing anti-discrimination policies. The Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe was particularly disturbed by examples of public support for homophobic projects and initiatives and by the adoption of the anti-LGBT declarations. In her opinion, the stigmatization and hate directed at certain individuals or group of people carries a real risk of legitimizing violence against LGBT people. On the contrary, in the view of the Council of Europe, it is the role of local authorities to tackle conflicting situations in a non-discriminatory, transparent, and inclusive manner. Furthermore, the legalistic arguments advanced in defense of the anti-LGBT declarations and resolutions have in some cases, not all, been successfully challenged in the Polish courts themselves. They have been challenged by the Polish ombudsman. First cases were lost due to the courts calling these declarations indeed only political declarations without any legal value, so they could not be challenged in court. But other regional courts have ruled 4 of these declarations of legal value and have annulled them as acts of local law. These judgments may still be appealed. In one case, it was announced by a Vice Minister of Justice that the public prosecutor would be charged to do so. It is also noted in these reports that the family charter may be more difficult to challenge in the courts because indeed it uses a more veiled language. LGBT is strategically not mentioned in the family charter, but then in the view of the Polish ombudsman, the general undefined and unclear terms in the family charter make them prone to being misused in the process of their application and interpretation. On the reform of the judiciary, there is a whole list of documents, so there is ample literature on the way in which we have to view these reforms and how we have to interpret them and how we have to value them against European standards and practices. I would mainly concentrate here then on the infringement procedures before the European Court of Justice, where indeed the disciplinary measures, or where 2 rulings have already been issued on the on reforms that had to do with the retirement age of judges of the ordinary courts and of the Supreme Court. These rulings have been abided by the Polish government, but there are 2 running infringement procedures, one on the disciplinary proceedings and one against the so-called Muzzle Law. I can recommend the literature of these judgments because in a very serene way, and again based on constant jurisprudence, they explain why indeed certain elements of the judiciary reform in Poland are diminishing the independence and impartiality of the courts. We also know that the Commission has started a rule of law cycle. It's a review cycle that is applicable on all member states. It's a form of political dialogue based, by the way, on a Belgian ID. Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs Didier Reynders proposed the initiative of periodic peer review of the rule of law in the EU. This ID has been integrated in the Commission proposal and is operational now, and also in the reports, annual reports that the Commission makes on the rule of law situation in the EU in general and in every member state. It is interesting reading in order to understand the real sense of the judiciary reforms and also the threat they hold for judicial independence. And why is this also important? And that is the more fundamental misunderstanding that I would like to develop. The concern, again, expressed by European institutions or the international community is often discarded in Poland as an unacceptable intrusion into Poland's internal affairs and constitutional order. However, such an objection would ignore the obligations and commitments arising from the international and European legal order. Poland is a fully fledged and long-standing member of the international legal system and human rights protection mechanisms, including the European Convention on Human Rights and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Poland is currently a member of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and in that capacity it's expected, and I quote the resolution that founded the Human Rights Council, it's expected to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. No member of the international community would feel comfortable about its international reputation when simultaneously subject to the Article 7 procedure of the Treaty on the European Union regarding a serious threat, a systemic threat of the rule of law, and to be simultaneously subject also to the monitoring procedure of the Council of Europe, not to speak about being faced with several, for the same reason, being faced with several infringement procedures. The concerned reaction of Poland's peers in the EU, Council of Europe, OSCE, United Nations is not driven by an unhealthy urge to meddle in the internal affairs of another country. Even less, it is a concerted action to stigmatize one country. It stems from a responsible attitude to preserve the integrity of the international and European legal order. Faced with a massive political and judicial mobilization, the Polish authorities argue that the competence to define the legal position of the judiciary has not been conferred on the Union by the member states and remains within the exclusive competence of the member states. This is, of course, not contested, that the organization of the judiciary system is the internal competence of the member states, be it that, as the Court of Justice of the EU has noted, when exercising that competence, the member states are required to comply with their obligations deriving from EU law. National judges are also EU judges. The independence of national judges is a key component of the rule of law and is crucial for the effective judicial cooperation between member states or for a smooth functioning of the internal market. The independence of the judiciary is essential to make the EU system function, where laws are to be applied effectively and need to be applied uniformly. The respect for the rule of law is a prerequisite for mutual trust between member states. The rule of law is a common interest and a common responsibility of EU institutions and member states. And here the primacy of EU law comes into play. It is a principle upheld for decades already by the Court of Justice of the European Union. It entails that member states cannot unilaterally invalidate EU laws or come up with their own interpretation, and neither can their courts. If national courts were allowed to ignore EU laws or rulings of the Court of Justice, they could set aside those they see as unfavorable to their country, and the EU legal order would erode. It is this very principle of the primacy of EU law that is being contested in the official Polish line of defense. As I understand the Polish Constitutional Tribunal jurisprudence, the Constitutional Tribunal has never considered the primacy of EU law as absolute, allowing for the possibility of refusing to apply EU law in exceptional situations, even though this so far never happened. But it appears that since 2016, this EU-friendly case law of the Constitutional Tribunal is being replaced by a categorical, but, as scholars point out, ill-founded legal stance that gives precedence to the Polish constitutional order, as it did recently in matters regarding the national judiciary. I think I can round off my expose here, because indeed the day before yesterday, in reaction to a new referral to the European Court of Justice in an infringement procedure, the counter-reaction of the Polish government was to ask a legal opinion on its own to its own constitutional tribunal about hearing it confirmed that the Polish constitutional order has precedence over EU law. So it is a very actual topic I think we have been discussing here, and there is much more to say, but I'm open for questions and answers after Professor Styczynska has given her view on the matter. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, or maybe good evening. Ambassador Jacobs, Rector Levens, Professor Verpost, thank you for having me. Thank you for this privilege to speak about the Polish case today. And it's a great honor. I'm a bit sad I can't be with you in beautiful Leuven, but I hope we can make it up later on. But it's also a big challenge, because all of these things that you have mentioned Ambassador are pretty interesting, and they are also multi-layered. They are also very complex, as you yourself noticed. And I made a lot of notes, and I will try to make a long story short, obviously to leave a room for questions, comments, remarks. But maybe let me start from referring to your title, that is a tale of misunderstandings, that I very much like, and I think that it itself explains a lot already, because indeed we do have a problem with communication, and we do have also a problem that is based, in my opinion, on a different visions of Europe. That some of, at least political, part of Polish political elite is sharing. So in my opinion, if we want to make a long story short, we can observe now in Poland at least two narratives on Europe and on European Union, on European integration. And one of them that is predominantly presented by the ruling coalition, because it's not only Law and Justice Party, but also a coalition partners, is a nativist vision of Europe. And in this vision, Poland is seen as a kind of embodiment of the true European values, but these values are a bit different to what, especially in Western Europe, you consider to be European values. So these values are traditional, these values are conservative, they are Christian, they speak about nation state as the most important entity in international relations. And this nation state is also understood in the ethnic terms. But also very often this nativist discourse is connected or is happening in conjunction with the populism. So it shares this quite dichotomous vision of a community being divided into a pure people and some corrupted foreign elite. And in this respect, this type of rhetoric is definitely fueling Euroscepticism that Professor Verpost was mentioning at the very beginning of today's event. But on the other hand, we do have also another type of narrative in Poland nowadays. And this is, if I may call it, internationalist narrative. Which is much more open, it's much more inclusive, it's based on liberal values, it's based on appreciation of individualism. It also appreciates secular state and multiculturalism, seen rather as a positive thing than a danger. And obviously, when it comes to European integration, it would favor deeper and broader integration, especially political integration of the EU member states. So if you think about this dichotomy and these two different narratives, you start to understand why the things are so complicated in Poland. And on the one hand, we have this official narrative of law and justice-led government, but on the other hand, you also have opposition parties and a huge civic movement, a huge grassrooted movement that is actually contesting these policies that are implemented by law and justice government. So I always wonder from where this division comes from. And maybe division is not even the best word. Maybe cleavage would be a better word, because this is super deep division, super difficult to breach. And also it has influence on almost every aspect of life. So not only on political life, but also on cultural life, also on everyday life of citizens. And I won't go as far back in history, but if you think about last 30 years, so about this transformation process, about post-communist Poland, then you need to also acknowledge that the accession didn't automatically mean feeling of belonging. So on one hand, we had this quick, rapid transformation, adaptation to European rules and norms, incorporating European law, obviously. But on the other hand, on the level of identity, we are all aware it takes much longer to construct identity, to make people feel at home in European Union. And also the whole process of Europeanization, and I don't think only about Poland right now, I think about the whole Eastern enlargement, this process was rather top-down. So the transformation was rapid, but after accession was achieved, then we faced this so-called post-enlargement fatigue. So a kind of disappointment also with the costs of transformation, and also maybe expectations were higher than the results. Yeah. The other thing is, and I would like to point my finger here also to the so-called pro-European political parties and movements in Poland, that after accession became reality, we had a decade of civic platform-led government that treated EU, took it for granted. So European Union was not explained, was not discussed, there was no deliberation. There is, on the other hand, not a big tradition of deliberation generally in Poland. But on what I feel is that EU was portrayed as in the context of economic profits only, and was seen rather as a donor than as a partner, or as a community that we all belong to. And after this decade of civic platform rule, we arrived to a new elections, and these elections were won by Law and Justice Party, for whom Brussels, EU, European project, is perceived rather as a hostile, rather as an entity that is far away, entity that we don't have much influence on. Because they are sharing this rather more nativist vision of European Union and Europe in general. So this also overlapped with the international environment, with generally changes that were happening on the international arena. I think here mostly about presidency of Donald Trump, but also the things that were happening in the European context, refugee crisis, with which European Union didn't really deal in such a great manner, and it was politicized. It was obviously used by especially right-wing political parties and groupings, but also success of Viktor Orban and successfully completed reforms that were directing Hungary into this illiberal direction, illiberal trend. So this was all very tempting, I believe, also for Law and Justice Party, and they felt like this is the momentum. But generally, when you look at the opinion polls, and when you look at the support towards certain policies of the Polish government right now, also to judicial reform, also to all of the LGBT unfriendly zones, also to women's rights, to abortion ban, then you will see a huge discrepancy between the governmental message and the reality. So even the hard electorate of Law and Justice is often not supporting this type of policies that are implemented. And this is very interesting. It brings us again to this division and this polarization between right-wing Law and Justice plus minor coalition parties that are seeing EU as a threat, and to this other part of the Polish society that is very much hoping for European Union to get involved. European Union is seen in this respect here as a defender, as the last instance to which you can refer. And in this respect, I also hear a lot of complaints about lack of activity of European Union, of so-called procrastination of European Commission, but also not only European Commission, also Council of Europe. So on the one hand, we have Article 7 being triggered, we have the monitoring mechanism, but on the other hand, during 2020, there was not a single hearing in the Council regarding the Polish case. There is a lot of voices coming, especially from the civil society actors, but also from part of the political arena, that actually EU is not defending its own values as much as these certain actors were expecting. And also, there was quite a big hope seen in, especially after the first statements of Commissioner Vera Jourova, and later on nothing really happened, which as I understand brings a lot of disappointment. And I don't want to call it like Euroscepticism, because definitely these liberal actors are not Eurosceptic, and they do still trust and hope European Union will show a bit more of activity in this respect, but it brings maybe a bit of disappointment and bitterness. Law and Justice is often claiming that we are facing here a culture war, a war about values. And to be honest, I would agree here that we definitely speak about completely different visions. And these visions, they cannot be bridged. They cannot be joined. They cannot be put in the one box, and we cannot do anything to work around them. There are two different competing visions of Europe, and I think this is the biggest issue when it comes to the current political situation in Poland. But what I wanted to underline, as my time is almost over, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions and comments, is that we do have two Polands. Yeah, we have two currents that we are observing. One is, as I said, nativist, populist, looking at EU as a kind of a foreign entity, and we do have this other one, much more liberal, that is grassrooted very often. That is also fighting in order to protect institutions, in order to promote their vision. And here we have several organizations. Some of them were mentioned by Ambassador, but activists and also organizations such as Women's Strike, but also dealing with environment, dealing with minority protection, dealing with women's rights and LGBT rights, as I said. So in this respect, we cannot say that this is simple to unwrap, because this picture is very complex, and only the time will show which vision will prevail. But I think we cannot forget that activities of the government are actually not representing the whole society, especially when we look at the opinion polls, especially when we look at the structure of support towards Law and Justice coalition, especially when we look at the age groups, gender groups. This picture is a bit more complex than I think it looks like from mainstream media. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Styczynska, for your very interesting expose. We will now move on to the questions that have been sent to us by the audience who have followed the live stream. I will read some questions and I will give Mr. Ambassador the opportunity to answer. A first question that has been asked by Jacques-Erik Laya is, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for the words so far. His question is, how do you reconcile the high pro-European sentiment in among Polish citizens? He mentions a poll, 72% in 2018, 2019. and the continued support to the often anti-EU government, the anti-LGBT policy, justice reform. So how do you reconcile this pro-European sentiment on the one hand with the support for a perceived anti-EU government?
Well, I cannot read the soul of the Polish voter, but it is indeed, it is a paradox. There is a very high support of the European Union, very high support of the European integration process. I would say it is also the question what type of integration is meant here. And maybe that explains part of the question, or the paradox rather, in the sense that part of the Polish population and electorate may be seduced by a very patriotic stance as taken by the government, and while at the same time seeing all the benefits arising from EU membership. Maybe at a certain point this paradox will come further into the open, but the patriotic message is an important one, and the message of sovereignty, of control over own affairs. But then again, the question is, what type of European integration do we speak about, and what type of integration is actually being supported when we have to interpret these opinion polls?
Yeah, and it's true. I remember in August, I think the Eurobarometer results still gave, from the Polish side, the support for the European Union. Seeing the European Union having a positive image was still 55%, which puts Poland among the highest supporters, let's say, of the European Union among all EU member states. So it's an interesting, almost contradiction we could mention. Okay, then there is another question for both Mr. Ambassador and Professor Styczynska. Do both of you think that Poland will leave the EU in the future, and will this increase the Euroscepticism in other member countries of the EU? The question is to Mr. Ambassador, but also what is your perspective on this, Professor Natasha Styczynska? Thank you both for this interesting lecture. It's from Pepe and Zichterman.
Do I start?
Yes, please.
Well, this is the question related to the famous or infamous expression Polexit. I mentioned it in the beginning because it is a word that often pops up when one tries to, or when media and commentators and observers try to interpret what is happening and where it is leading to. But I do not think that it is realistic to think that Poland would really take that route. It is more about asserting national sovereignty within a European context, and then referring sort of more to the goalist, the idea of the goal of a Europe of sovereign nations. That is like the model that the current Polish ruling coalition is following and is abiding by.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Professor Styczynska, do you also have comments on this, or
yeah, I couldn't agree more, because this is exactly what I also feel. I can't see any support towards Polexit. Also, Brexit was very much seen as a negative thing. So all the polls are showing that Poles are pro-European, but they don't want to see more of the intervention coming from outside into the domestic matters. And when it comes to voting for Law and Justice and the Law and Justice Coalition, this is not driven by their European policy. All the opinion polls are showing that electorate of Law and Justice is mainly convinced by their social policies. So it's mainly about economic issues rather than European policy of law and justice. And I think that this is also why they are maneuvering in a way to keep on this kind of pro-European message still on top of their agenda, because majority of Poles would like to see Poland staying in EU.
Okay, thank you, Professor Styczyńska. Then another question for Mr. Ambassador, and then there's also one other for Professor Styczyńska. First, Mr. Ambassador, from Isabella Cantor. Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Can you please comment on the recent referral of Poland to the European Court of Justice by the Commission? Do you think anything of substance will change as a result? Thank you.
The recent referral to the Court of Justice is, I think, a very important moment for EU law, because there was the feeling that previous also preliminary rulings of the European Court of Justice have not been followed by the Polish government. Also, referral to the court means that the first notification, the recent opinion that the Commission is formulating on the anxiety that exists about the effect of certain reforms, that the Polish government, Polish authorities have not adequately responded to that. So then the Commission does not see any other solution than to turn to the court, and then it is indeed up to the court to interpret EU law and to let's say, to react against violations of EU law if it finds that indeed EU law is being violated. So in itself it is a very important moment for the integrity of the European legal order. What it will change in practice, well, let's first wait for the judgment of the European Court of Justice. And then in most cases, and especially when judgments are accompanied by a penalty, or how do you call this technically, by a sum of money that has to be paid for not abiding by the judgments, then these are very powerful instruments in order to have EU law respected. But let's first wait and see what the judgment of the European Court of Justice will be.
Okay, thank you. Then there's several questions on the same topic to Professor Natasza Styczyńska. I will read one, but several have the same connotation. Given today's meeting of Salvini, Orban and Morawiecki would result in a new European Parliament fraction that will potentially embody the sort of EU identity the Law and Justice Party tends to paint. So the question is a bit unclear. It's actually on the meeting of Salvini, Orban and Morawiecki. Will it result in a new fraction that will depict a sort of EU identity that is conform to the one Law and Justice intends to paint? Could you maybe give your opinion on this? Lots of curiosity about this meeting.
Yeah, I'm also very curious to learn what will be the outcome. We know that already several initiatives like that had taken place previously. So there was an aim to build some kind of international front that would be actively lobbying for less integrated Europe, so economically integrated, but not politically integrated. And Law and Justice, as for now, is part of ECR, European Conservatives and Reformists, which also, I think, until departure of UK from EU and European Parliament was able to have an impact on the policy making and also on the message of the European Parliament. But I am aware that after Brexit, there are now a couple of new initiatives, but I am unable to say what will happen and whether they will be effectively able to cooperate, because to create a fraction, obviously, if you fulfill all the conditions, this is not such a difficult thing. But to agree on one agenda, agree on one message is, especially for those parties who are driven by some nationalist sentiments, that's sometimes quite a challenge.
Okay, thank you. Then there is also a question for Mr. Ambassador concerning the foreign policy of the Polish government. I think it's also interesting. Dear Ambassador, asks Julia Lissens, thank you for your comprehensive presentation. How would you assess current foreign policy of the Polish government, especially towards Russia, Belarus, and the USA? Thank you in advance. Mm-hmm. It's not an easy question, but it's also different countries.
This leads us some distance away from the topic,
yeah.
But it's an interesting question, and it relates to my job. Anyhow, when I spoke in the beginning of my exposé about the contribution of Poland to the EU. I could have explained also that Poland is as a country, because of its geographical and, can we say, geopolitical situation, it is a very interesting vantage point to observe indeed the eastern neighborhood. And we see that Poland is indeed playing a very prominent role in the shaping of the eastern neighborhood policy of the European Union, and has also, of course, very fixed views on what is happening in Belarus, and then on the role of Russia in general. So I think it is important to listen to Poland and to follow Polish foreign policy with regard to the eastern neighborhood. It is an area where Poland has developed a lot of expertise, also because of historic experiences. And we also see that, for example, in the Baltic countries. So this is an added value that Poland can bring to European foreign policy.
Yeah, for sure. Also during the Ukraine crisis, I think Poland was one of the leading EU countries trying to appease what was going on. Okay, thank you. Then there is another question. Well, there are several questions also on economy and economic policy. There's one addressed to both Professor Styczynska and Ambassador Jacobs from Ivo Rulands. Is it possible that a different speed in economic growth and in improvement of employees' living standards might have resulted in a general discontent in Poland? Is the question.
I think that Professor Styczynska can answer that much better than I can. I could only say that different speed. It is a fact that Poland is catching up in terms of its economic development, and is particularly succeeding in catching up thanks to its EU membership. And also we can see how Poland, also because of its geographical location, is a very popular destination still for foreign direct investment. So Poland is very well positioned to catch up quickly in terms of its economic development. It shows a lot, the Polish economy has shown a lot of resilience, for example, during the past COVID crisis. Past current COVID crisis.
Okay, Professor Styczynska, apart from this question, I will take the opportunity to also direct two more questions to you before returning to Mr. Ambassador. There is another question to you, Professor Syczynska. How should we, in your opinion, go forward in order to bring Poland towards rather than away from the EU and protect the rule of law? And there's also another question you might also immediately answer. What is the role of disinformation and current media in cleavages of Polish society? I think the last one is also a very pertinent one for our discussion today.
Thank you very much for all of the questions. I am not an economist, but looking from a more social perspective, definitely on the one hand, a rapid, pretty well-going transformation, development, ability to deal with crises, not only COVID crisis economically, but also a previous economic crisis. This also comes with a cost. And there is a certain group of citizens who are not beneficiaries of this transformation. They are rather losers of transformation. And in this respect, they are obviously also rather blaming the whole Europeanization process for that. So definitely the speed here played a role. But on the other hand, I doubt we could make it slower. This was not the case. Also, Poland is a big country comparing to other countries in the region. So this transition was a bit more difficult, especially when we think about industry. And obviously, as I said, these losers of transformation would rather be less pro-European. They would also be rather unhappy with the current state of affairs. Answering the other questions, what can be done to keep Poland within a European family, if I understand well, rather than push it away? I mean, I don't know, to be honest, what are the possibilities, because it seems that all of the legal ways are actually used. Maybe they could be used more effectively. This is at least what I learned from talking with the activists, talking with the politicians, when I'm trying to map this pro and anti-European stances. So in this respect, I think we do have mechanisms, but maybe they are not used well enough. The very good example here is LGBT-free zones that Ambassador mentioned. And one of the reactions when it comes to this type of symbolic declaration was withdrawal of this multi and bilateral agreements between the cities that announced these LGBT-free zones and their partner cities, mainly in France and Germany. And the reaction to that was that, yeah, this is a right thing to do, but maybe on the other hand, would be better to just go there and explain why LGBT community should not be seen as a threat. So maybe much more in engagement on this local level, coming from EU to provincial little towns and villages would be welcome, because the big cities are obviously a different story, and they are much more open, they are much more pro-European. And the last question, if I may jump quickly to it, and role of disinformation, it's a super interesting question, and it's actually a very broad topic. What I can say is that definitely disinformation plays a huge role here, but also a general media structure and the way media are functioning in Poland. So also the usage of a state advertisement in order to fund pro-governmental media, both printed and online media, plays a significant role. Of course, there is also an engagement of the foreign actors when it comes to disinformation campaigns, and this can be observed everywhere around Europe. And of course, Poland is not free from cases like that. So in this respect, it's a completely separate topic that I guess we could discuss for ages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have two more questions. One first is a question for an opinion of Belgian diplomacy, so I will address it to you, and then a last question I will address to both of you. The first one is from Jonas van der Schuren, who says, Dear Ambassador, I'm researching contemporary Polish theater, this is about culture, and have lived in Warsaw for several years. I was wondering if Belgian diplomacy has any stance on the political pressure that Polish cultural life is under. For example, the case at the Teatr Polski in Wrocław or the Teatr Powszechny in Warsaw, to conform, and the pressure to conform to the current government's cultural policy, which is putting artists, curators, and cultural workers under intense pressure, and as has been mentioned during these two lectures, is one of the sides of a culture war within Poland. I know it's a bit of a controversial question, but the question is if Belgian diplomacy has been confronted with this or has any stance or opinion about this.
Yeah, it's indeed. I see why the question is asked, and especially from somebody from the field. The current government lays other accents in terms of what is being promoted as culture or types of cultural projects that are, let's say, deemed to be more interesting also to get subsidies and so on. But it's a bit awkward for me to comment on that. But I would certainly not deny the fact that when it comes to bilateral cultural cooperation, but which is more the competence of our communities, the federated entities of Belgium, they have to take that into account when it is about programmation of festivals or programations of or sending a cultural ensemble, a theater group or a music ensemble to Poland. So it is part and parcel of today's reality. But I'm personally at the federal level, so to say, I'm less involved in that in order to have a very clear view on what that means in terms of policy and cultural diplomacy.
Okay, but thank you for your comments on this topic. Then maybe, because we still have 1 minute, a last question addressed to both Mr. Ambassador and Professor Styczynska, which is on EU policy. It's an interesting question by Boris Ostapchuk, who says, Mr. Ambassador and Professor Styczynska, Article 7.1 has been invoked for the first time in its history towards Poland back in 2017. But it did not work in the end because it requires a unanimous vote by all EU countries, and Hungary obviously did not agree. Now I have two questions considering that. First of all, how can the formation of smaller alliances inside of the European Union threaten or perhaps benefit the EU itself? And a second question, should the EU rethink the way it keeps other countries in check, since this situation, for example, clearly exposes the weaknesses of Article 7 and it feels as if the EU does not really have other answers? It's a difficult question to end, but I think an interesting one, so I'm curious to hear your opinion of both of you.
Yeah. Indeed, the Article 7 procedure has been activated for the first time because of a systemic threat of the rule of law in Poland. It has not been carried through till the end, because indeed there would be a blocking majority. On the other hand, the fact that the mechanism has been activated and the fact that the mechanism is still ongoing, that the proceedings are still ongoing, they are hindered also by the corona pandemic in terms of organization of hearing sessions and so on. They cannot be organized as they should be organized, but they are still on the agenda. They are still on the political agenda of the EU, and that in itself is important because it is a very important political signal among peers, among governments, to say we have a problem, we see a systemic threat, and Article 7 is very much based on political dialogue, and it is that type of political dialogue we could only encourage to be carried through in order to dissipate, to dispel misunderstandings, and to come to a clear common understanding about what indeed we are talking here about in our interconnected European legal order.
It's very nicely said, thank you. Professor Styczynska, would you like to comment also on this question?
Oh, I very much agree with Mr. Ambassador. I also see it that way, and I think that it was several times underlined that you cannot and will not tolerate threats against the press of freedom of press, human rights, also judicial system. But what matters is that it's also clear that if you are breaching these values, then there are consequences. So dialogue, yes, but also we need to be ready to find other solutions, I believe. So that's my take on that.
Okay, so then I thank you both very much. There's many other questions. I'm afraid we're not able to answer them all, but I can try to make sure that they reach Mr. Ambassador and Professor Styczynska in a written manner. And then I would like to thank you all for being here, and also point out that the live stream, you can always watch it again on the website of the Ambassador's Lectures series. So thank you all and have a very nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.